Thank you all very much for being here on the second day of the USC Sports and the LGBT Experience Conference. Day one was extraordinarily successful, and we are excited for what today brings. We have a great panel that I'll introduce in a few moments. And we hope that you can stay later on for our 2 o'clock panel that is on LGBT sports and the collegiate experience, that will be looking at specifically what goes on here at USC and at other colleges and universities in terms of the LGBT and sports intersection. But first, today, I'm going to introduce, many of you met her yesterday. She did a great job presenting her research. Jayne Caudwell joins us, I think, from probably the furthest in the room. She is all the way here from the United Kingdom, where she works at the University of Brighton, and she has been studying and publishing on LGBT experiences in sport for over 3 decades, and her teaching research focus on gender and sexualities in sport and leisure contexts is well regarded all over the world, and we are very happy to have her all the way here. And please join me in welcoming Jayne, who is going to introduce the rest of the panel.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you again for yesterday. I don't know how many of you were here yesterday, but it was a great day with the 2 sessions yesterday, and I'm looking forward to today as well. So I'm just going to introduce the 3 speakers. They're going to speak one after the other, and then we'll have time at the end for questions. So I am going to try and turn it to the audience to ask questions. So maybe you can think about asking questions as you're listening to their papers. And so the first speaker is Mary Louise Adams, and her paper's entitled No Taste for Rough and Tumble Play, Sport Discourses and the Regulation of Effeminacy. Mary Louise Adams is Professor in the School of Kinesiology and Health Studies in the graduate program in Cultural Studies at Queen's University in Canada. She is the author of Artistic Impressions, Figure Skating, Masculinity and the Limits of Sport, which was published in 2011, which is a great book, so I highly recommend it. And also the author of The Trouble with Normal, Post-War Youth and the Making of Heterosexuality, and that was published in 1997. She has published on the history of sexuality, queer and feminist social movements, and gender and sexuality in sport. So, okay, thanks.
We're going to stand up today. Yesterday was the sitting down day. Today's the standing up day. Is it all right if I move this, if I'm not going to just put it on the table? Okay. All the technology can go over here. Have any of you ever been to an academic conference before? The undergrad students? Not so many. We're going to be more like a regular academic conference today. We're going to be giving formal papers in the way that we would normally at a conference, hopefully geared to your interests a little bit more. So there's a couple of things you need to know before I get started with this paper. And the first is that the bulk of my work on sport has been concerned with gender and sexuality. As Jayne mentioned, I just finished a huge, embarrassingly long project on gender in sport that focused in on figure skating, a sport that is so obviously gendered that that's as far as many people can get with it. Like, what is going on in that sport? The skating research was primarily concerned with men and about the way male skaters, like male dancers, I've also written a lot about male dancers, are perceived by people inside and outside the sport. I thought that a project on figure skating was a good way to help me understand what out in the world people think about sport and masculinity and gayness and all sorts of kind of bigger questions about the relationship between sport and gender. That project ended up basically being a book about effeminacy. And while I would happily never write another word about skating, I'm not quite finished with effeminacy yet. I feel like there's still a lot of work to do when we talk about gender nonconformity. Not just transgenderism, but of course also transsexuality, transgender issues, but gender nonconformity in general, and particularly around men's and boys' gender nonconformity. We're getting a little bit better in our social institutions and in our culture at large, accommodating and dealing with lesbians and gay men and kind of, homosexuality as this thing that we now pay attention to. Little bit of progress in kind of tiny institutional changes around transgenderism and transsexuality, but our culture still freaks out around femininity and men and boys, and so this is something I want to know more about. The second thing I want to say before I get started is that people who study sports sociologically and historically, I would count myself among those people, often we talk with our students about how sport reflects the broader society. So we see homophobia in sport because there is homophobia in the world at large in sport, and sport is in the world. It's not this separate thing. That's pretty straightforward. We also talk about the way that sport actually helps shape, like, the world outside of sport. That, you can make the little double-headed arrow and have sport here and the broader culture here. And the relationship goes both ways. It's the relationship from sport to the broader culture, that direction, that I'm going to be looking at today. So this paper is about effeminacy, something not very much appreciated in North American cultures, even in the GLBTQ communities, I would think. And I want to talk about the role played by sport in the marginalization of effeminate boys and men. How do our ideas about the relationship between gender and sport affect boys and men, not just on the field, but in general? So the people about whom I'm concerned are gender non-conforming boys, boys who would be classified as feminine or as sissies in dominant cultures. The particular mark of this thing called gender nonconformity that I'm interested in is what's called in psychological literatures aversion to rough and tumble games. I didn't make up that phrase in my title. It's actually something, you can Google rough and tumble play and you'll find some. It's a term used by psychologists. And it's a kind of activity, what they're referring to in the psychology literature is a kind of very aggressive play that we see among small children. Mammals, of all sorts of other kinds of mammals. You can read about rough and tumble play in squirrels. Do you have squirrels? Do you have squirrels that run around? And it's a very specific kind of activity. When it gets taken up, there's specific qualities of the activity. I won't even bother going into it. But when it gets taken up in more general literatures, the specificity that some researchers use with that term is lost. That's important for my work, but you don't really need to worry about it. And what happens is that sport gets kind of conflated with this term. Even though, like squirrels tumbling around in the tree, little children tumbling around the tree, that's very different than sport, right? Sport's very organized and institutionalized. But because it's conflated in all sorts of writing, I'm conflating it here too. That's all you need to know about that. So, a dislike of or an inaptitude for rough and tumble play and athletic games, it often goes like that, is one of the more common reasons why boys and men are pegged as sissies. One of the great resources that discourses about sissiness draw on is this kind of common sense notion we have that masculinity and athleticism are linked in some way. So a boy or a man who doesn't exhibit any desire for sport or whose body doesn't perform sporting skills loses his access to some kind of key marker of masculinity. And there's all sorts of research that shows that boys who are afraid of being called sissies develop their athletic abilities to kind of protect themselves. So that helps us understand how that works. And there's all sorts of homophobia under there because gender, sexual orientation, and bodies in our culture are all supposed to line up. You have this kind of genitals, you get assigned this gender, and then you're supposed to have this sexual orientation. In our field of sports sociology, researchers have long talked about sport discourses as powerful contributors to mainstream masculine norms. And there's lots of research about hockey or football or boxing that looks at how sport discourses interact with race, class, ability, age. Lots of studies about athletes in school sports that look at how boys and men's sports experiences shape their understandings of their own masculine identity, There's studies of masculinity in the sport media, which some of you might be particularly interested in. But what I'm going to talk about here is a little bit different. I look to a source where you wouldn't necessarily think to look to find out how ideas about sport and masculinity are linked. I looked at the DSM. Are y'all familiar with the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association? This is like called the Psychiatry's Bible, the big list of illnesses. So for those of you in the States, you have health insurance, private health insurance. You have to convince your insurer that you actually have a mental illness and should receive care for which they should pay. You need the DSM. That tells you what your illness is. Of course, there's all sorts of critical literature on the DSM. It's very problematic in many ways. So the particular disorder that I looked at is called gender identity disorder in childhood. And it first appeared in the DSM-3, which was in 1980. It was revised again in 1994. And it's just been, the DSM's just come out with a new edition, DSM-5. We went from Roman numerals to regular numerals. And it came out this last May. And now we don't have GIDC, gender identity disorder. We have something called gender dysphoria. But because this edition is very new, I'm going to talk about GIDC. It's the diagnosis that was meant to be applied to children who exhibit a strong and persistent cross-gender identification. So children who'd been raised and identified as boys who cross-identify with girls. So you see there's this very binary notion of gender working in there. It's a diagnosis that has mostly been applied to boys. And there's different criteria, diagnostic criteria, lists of symptoms for boys and girls. So the DSM-4, I'm going to tell you about the criterion there. There's two parts. Part A, a child had to show a strong and persistent cross-gender identification, and they had to have 4 out of 5, they had to meet 4 out of 5 of these criteria. Only one of these criteria involved the child saying, I really, really, really want to be a boy, or I really, really want to be a girl, which you would think that would be kind of central to this diagnosis. But only one of the criteria, and you didn't need to meet all the criteria. The other criteria were all about behaviors related to dress, cross-dressing, to play, including the intense desire to participate in the stereotypical games and pastimes of the other sex. So that's part A. Part B demanded that the child experience persistent discomfort with his or her sex, or sense of inappropriateness in the gender role of that sex. So we kind of expect something like this. For a boy, the gender discomfort could be made evident by, quote, an assertion that his body, his penis or testes are disgusting or will disappear, or assertion that it would be better not to have a penis, or, this is the part that is surprising here, so assertion, like this thing about his body, or an aversion toward rough and tumble play and rejection of male stereotypical games and sports. Or, either or, right? Like these two things are being equated here. That little word or is doing a lot of work here, putting play behaviors on equal footing with emotionally painful experience. The DSM suggests in a kind of discussion piece later on that the children we're talking about here would avoid rough and tumble play and competitive sports and have little interest in cars and trucks or other non-aggressive but stereotypical boys' toys. As a sports scholar, this is where I started to get really interested in this as a document that could teach us about the relationship between gender and sports. So how did these ideas find themselves into the DSM? There's all sorts of critiques about gender identity disorder that you can find online that have been going on for years. And in the longer paper, I would tell you all about them. I would also tell you all about the new diagnosis called gender dysphoria. After all these critiques, you'd think, okay, the APA can rewrite this disorder. And because of Americans in health insurance, it is necessarily that there is something in the DSM. People in other countries say, just get rid of it. American, you guys have health insurance, you need these diagnostic categories so that people can get insurance. So, there were changes, definitely, to the entry in 2013. They could have made really big changes. They do focus more on distress as kind of something that it's only disorder if there's distress, but they also include all the same behavioral categories. So in boys, a strong rejection of typically masculine toys, games, and activities, and a strong avoidance of rough and tumble play. Very specific. In girls, a strong rejection of typically feminine toys, games, and activities. Why couldn't they just say, in children, a rejection of their typical games and activities. They have to pinpoint this thing, rough and tumble play. So obviously there's something very important in this concept that boys have to engage in a particular kind of play that they subsume sport on top of, or, you can start looking for gender disorders. So we have to ask why the people who wrote the new diagnosis felt it necessary to retain this focus on behaviors, when apparently the point of making the revision was to address children's own feelings and also any kind of distress that came out of what they call this gender dysphoria, not feeling right in their body. We might also ask why the need to distinguish out of all the possible options this one type of play for boys. Would it not have been enough simply to say for both boys and girls that they reject the typical play activities of their assigned gender? So I set out in a research project to kind of answer those questions. And I'm not going to tell you all about the research project here, but the question that launched the project was, how is it that such blatantly stereotypical notions of gender and play and sport, notions that have long since been discredited in my field, in psychology itself, in social sciences more broadly, how did those stereotypical, outmoded ideas get into the DSM where, in the first place, where they have played a role in pathologizing boys' gender nonconformity? Some of the terms people use now are gender independence, gender creativity. You probably know other terms for this too. So to answer the questions, what I did is I went back and I looked at the kind of scientific studies, the psychological research that was the basis of the writing of the original diagnosis in the DSM. And there's another scholar who's done excellent work on this. His name's Bryant. He's a sociologist. He works at one of the state universities in New York now. So he's done kind of this general thing. What I was looking for was the specific work that took up ideas about play and sport to see how they got into the DSM. What I did first, though, is I looked at a really broad literature on children's play from the first half of the 20th century, trying to see how psychologists distinguish between girls and boys' game, like girls' game and play preferences and boys' game and play preferences. And what this huge, well, it's not a huge body of literature, but like this long 50-year strand of literature showed over the early course of the 20th century, from fairly similar play patterns and play preferences, if not patterns, but what girls and boys wanted to play, girls stayed very, 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 and you won't be surprised to hear this, girls stay very diverse in their preferences. Boys' preferences over the 20th century get narrower and narrower and narrower and narrower and narrower, till all of a sudden boys want to play football. And the researchers are noticing this, and they're saying, like, what is going on here? And they eventually start making arguments that what become the preferred games for boys in the 1940s, in the 1950s, going into the 60s, are the things that boys can use to distinguish themselves from girls. So baseball stops being the most popular sport because girls also play baseball, even though, we have all sorts of arguments to make about that. But girls also play baseball. Boys start loving football. And girls, they would do surveys, they would get like 20, 30 different games or things that girls preferred. Boys they'd do the survey, they'd get 3, 4. Boys' gender norms become very narrow into the 1950s. So I looked at that literature. That literature fed into a literature that wasn't just about distinguishing boys from girls. It was about distinguishing and I'll just talk about boys, but there is a little teeny tiny literature on girls too. The normal boys from the abnormal boys. And that's the most important literature here. They were looking at feminine behaviors. This starts in about the 1960s. They're looking for things like, he wiggled like a girl when dancing. He doesn't want to play baseball. He's afraid of getting hurt. Very small studies, first off. You can tell that the researchers, they only had like 5 people. Like, it's not like people are knocking down the psychologist's doors going, we need to study feminine boys. They actually had to go out and look for 5 boys that they could bring in their study. They're actually constructing feminine behavior as a problem of psychiatry and psychology. Like, we call this the construction of social problems, right? So here's the construction of a problem of psychiatry or psychology. It wasn't like parents were all like, they thought it was a phase. It's not like people liked when their little boys were behaving in ways that they didn't see as conventional, but they didn't think it was a mental illness. What happens in the 1960s, these researchers start making it so that we see this as a mental illness. I'm just going to talk to you about 2 studies. How am I doing for time? Okay. 2 studies. What they start doing, because they're not getting a lot of boys, they have to make, measurement instruments, scales like they use in psychology. They start making scales and measurement instruments because they want to throw a really wide net to find more evidence of abnormality here. So in the early 1970s, one set of researchers made up what they called the Gender Behavior Inventory for Boys. And this was a 173-item questionnaire that the mothers would fill out. What are they looking for? And they grouped them into factors. Feminine behavior. Swishes his hips while walking. Likes to dance. Plays with dogs. Something they called extroversion. Popular with boys. Jumps from heights and across ditches. Is physically aggressive. Performs strenuous activity. Will keep playing even with torn clothes. Another factor, behavior disturbance. Tantrums, whiny, bossy, pouts, lies to mother. Anyway, you go through the whole study, and the authors had hypothesized that boys with gender disturbance would score lower on this thing than normal boys, and because they wrote their study and their questionnaire to reflect the kind of common sense notions in the world, the mothers reflected those common sense notions in the world, and gee, the scale works. Same authors, same year, they decided to focus very, very specifically on play. And little has been done to establish play behavior as a measure of gender deviance. So they designed another questionnaire, and this one is just called the Games Inventory. Again, parents fill it out, and they just tick. Boy does this, not this. It's all for boys, right? They're way more concerned with boys. And they group these into feminine preschool games. The assumption there is that girls play preschool games well as they go older, whereas boys, being more developmentally advanced, get rid of the feminine games, or the preschool games. So one category is called feminine preschool games. Let's see. What are the other ones? Masculine non-athletic games and athletic games are the different categories. They compare the results of the survey for normal boys and boys who are already seeing psychologists or psychiatrists or other kinds of clinicians who have already been determined to have gender abnormalities. So they compare the results, and once again, their scale actually measures the thing they say that they were trying to measure. All sorts of other scales developed over the years. And eventually, these are the kinds of studies that become the basis for the diagnosis that ends up in the DSM in 1980. So why these particular notions of play and these long criticized stereotypes? All I can do is speculate here. So one, I think that an idealized version of normal play actually gave clinicians and researchers a goal that they could achieve through treatment. So if through treatment a boy would learn athletic skills or developed a comfort with rough and tumble play, the clinician could demonstrate not just that he had stopped doing girly behavior, but that he actually had switched over to be performing a kind of accepted version of masculinity. And the reason that athleticism is a sign of that is because we believe that our bodies, if you didn't have the right body, if you couldn't be normal, you wouldn't be able to do the athleticism, right? So there's this kind of biological thing that sport allows us to have faith in. George Records, who is a researcher, was one of the main players. He was from UCLA. Huge list of studies. He actually developed an athletic training program that was part of the behavior modification for boys in his studies. So the behavior modification, if you're looking at athleticism, is not just about stopping feminine behaviors, stopping playing with girls, or getting a boy to stop trying to make girls' clothes out of tea towels or whatever. Not wearing women's clothes is not quite the same as being masculine. The emphasis on masculine games and sport was a way for clinicians to forge a real masculine identity, because we see that sport is supposed to be about masculinity. So this is the conclusion. Sports like this, huge. We talk about sport, but sport's huge, right? Like there's the NFL and there's kids down the street playing baseball. Some of you have gone in fundraising runs. Sport is a huge category. The assumption that grounds this paper is that some of the mainstream cultural understandings around sport and gender make life hell for feminine boys. The incredible prominence of sport in our culture as an obligatory form of physical activity for school children, as a venerated form of physical expression, as a big mediated spectacle mean that these discourses about gender and sport have a very long reach. Everybody knows about them. While the physical activities out of which sports have been created have no inherent gender, sport is, without question, one of the most profoundly gendered institutions in contemporary North America. Indeed, for many people, even those competing in queer sport events, a gender-free sport remains unthinkable. Could it be possible for sport to play a cultural role that does not reinforce heteronormative binary understandings of gender? There's all sorts of people who are trying to do this at the community level, subverting normative styles of play, different kinds of co-ed fun leagues, and that sort of stuff. Sport is one of the most, if not the most pervasive cultural form on the planet, and we need to change what it signifies. Effeminate boys and other gender non-conforming people need sport and masculinity not to be so tightly entwined. More than this, frankly, I think they need a world with less sport in it. Capital S mainstream sport, despite the presence of increasing number of women and girls, continues to privilege and keep in circulation certain normative masculinities. As much as I love watching and playing my own favorite sports, I'd argue strongly that sport, as an institutionalized set of physical practices, the meanings of which are overdetermined by gender norms, has yet had little to offer to a queer physical culture. As Judy Davidson has argued in a critique of the gay games, if queer people want to find any liberatory potential in sport, we need to invest in its disruption. Queer people need a physical culture that extends rather than constrains queerness. And I'm not using queerness here as a simple synonym for lesbian and gay. Queer people need a physical culture that can help shift understandings of the body and gender, that can challenge the links between bodies, genders, and sexuality, that's not afraid to generate uncertainty about who can and should do what with their bodies. To rephrase Eve Sedgwick, queer people need institutions and cultural practices that affirm a desire that there be queer people in the immediate world. Without a drastic queering makeover, sport is not yet that thing. Thanks.
Thanks, Mary Louise. I'm going to introduce Evan to you now, and maybe some of you know him because he is from here. And Evan is a doctoral candidate in communication in the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism at the University of Southern California. So our next two speakers, Evan and Mike, are currently doing their PhDs. So I don't know if there are people in the room that aspire to go on to postgraduate study and to do PhD work. So this kind of gives you an introduction to some of the topics that students can look at. So Evan's work focuses on how media production and consumption cultivate LGBT identity and community. He is currently working on his dissertation, which uses queer theory and feminist critique to complicate media analysis of sport and sexuality. In particular, he is interested in how mediated content currently and historically establishes understandings of sports and sexuality, and how communities engage or disidentify with these narratives. He holds a BS in Communication with honours from Northwest University and an MA in Media, Culture and Communication from New York University. So,
Thank you, Jayne, and thank you again for agreeing to moderate this panel. I have a little bit of a PowerPoint. For most people who know me, they know that I'm a little bit technologically stunted, so hopefully it will all run well. There's a point where it's just lots of images in an attempt to help keep you all entertained. So hopefully it will work and run through. I created it on a Mac, so I've been told that there might be some problems, but we'll see what happens. So my presentation today focuses on gay sports bars. It's part of my dissertation project, a project that broadly asks how, in a culture that more openly and visibly engages with questions of sports and sexuality, is the discussion made salient through media engagements. It's interested in the ways that media acts as a disciplinary practice, and equally in how these modes, technologies, and images are reimagined, renegotiated, and reprioritized through discourse, disidentifications, and actualized spaces of queer and gay meaning-making. It investigates how LGBT individuals are interpolated by the media and how members of the LGBT community reinterpret the content in both emotional, virtual, and concretized sites of meaning-making. So how communities make room for themselves by piecing together a story of emergence from a set of representations. It's an attempt to think of culture not solely as constructed and controlled from above, but as both produced by and producing practices of living, as both created by and creating citizens. So why gay sports bars? I must say I came to this project with the fear that these spaces would not only continue to replicate patriarchal and heteronormative understandings of both sports and queer culture, but also adhere to assimilationist views of the gay population. Certainly, much academic work has interrogated the ways in which queer individuals are taught to replicate heterosexual culture in order to be better welcomed and tolerated within straight contexts, and I was interested to see if gay sports bars would unwittingly support this abjection of queerness in favor of a more palatable and heteronormative identification practice. So I quickly came to see that this either-or binary was a far too reductive and simplistic mode of analysis for understanding gay sports bars. Rather than positioning these spaces as either complicit or reactionary forces, I've come to understand them as producing a slippage within identification practices, which, far from shutting down the conversation of identity and affinity, have rather opened up a space with which to think through disidentifications. These bars neither opt to assimilate within a structure nor strictly oppose it. Rather, patrons utilize their disidentifications as a strategy that works on and against dominant ideology. So it's important to keep in mind that I'm using disidentifications, which is a term sort of produced by Jose Esteban Munoz, as a concept to mean the way cultural products and fields are decoded from the perspective of a minority subject who is disempowered in such a representational hierarchy. However, this manifestation is still experienced and negotiated not from a position outside those fields, but rather from within them. So as a practice, disidentification does not dispel those ideological contradictory elements, queerness and sports, but rather works to hold on to these notions and invest with them new life. Disidentification as a mode of analysis registers subjects as constructed and contradictory. So I'm assuming we have a lot of comm undergrads, comm majors, all right. So if you guys have come across Stuart Hall's Encoding Decoding, this is similar to what Stuart Hall would establish as sort of a negotiated reading, but it pays more attention, it focuses more on a subject who is a minority in sort of a majority experience. So I believe gay sports bars are useful in analyzing how queer engagements with and conversations about sports and contestations with static terminology illuminate the queer potentiality of sports portals and athletic fandom, while still making clear that sports and gay bars, as both separate and overlapping entities, continue to fall prey to patriarchal and heteronormative relations. So in the interest of time today, I'd like to work through my theoretical approach very quickly, as best I can, sketch a brief history of gay bars and gay sports bars, and finally think through some of the utopic kernels present in gay sports bars. What I don't spend as much time on today are the ways in which gay sports bars reproduce heteropatriarchy, though I hope my adherence to disidentifications will imply that heteronormative power is both reinforced and undermined in these spaces, though this work is continually performed by a minoritarian subject. So again, a lot of my work is interested in sort of moments of disruption, but again, I think it's really important to think about what are sort of the overarching ideologies that these moments are sort of attempting to disrupt or working within. So again, I've attempted to ground my project in a queer approach that rejects a minoritizing logic of toleration or simple political interest representation in favor of a more thorough resistance to regimes of the normal. So it's not just about who does or does not identify as gay, but thinking about when are there non-normative subjectivities, non-normative positions. This project uses the catalyst that queer culture tends to expand the possibilities of praxis, and the call that queer cultural workers are able to detect an opening and indeterminacy in what for many people is a locked-down dead commodity. So it sets about to rethink how we might queer an investigation of gay sports bars and fandom in order to locate them not as spaces where individual identities ask for recognition, but rather as territories where possibilities can arise. And it is this notion of queered potentiality that I want to return to and explore a little bit later. Even though these sites are often buoyed and or encapsulated by acts of consumption, desire, and the linearity of heteronormative time, they are also disruptions that contest the normative. They bring into question the binary of sexual essentialism and social constructivism, since they are located at precisely the point where these discourses short circuit, where they don't quite match up. All right, so and I guess one quick thing, just so people, I don't spend as much time, but it's important to think about too, I'm using queerness here to be separate from LGBT identity. So someone who might exist as a queer individual is not necessarily someone who self-identifies as part of the LGBT community, and vice versa. Someone who might be, for example, a gay man is not necessarily sort of a queer individual. Okay, so it might seem axiomatic to state that modern gay culture has always been associated with bar culture, but this connection is far from a contemporary construct and traces a history back to 19th century saloons, especially sort of early 19th century saloons, which have long challenged America's dominant family-centered culture by providing a gendered space for male congregation and sociability outside the home. Historically, this rise in the popularity of bars occurred simultaneously to the formation of gay ghettos in working-class neighborhoods. And as Michael Warner has further argued, in the lesbian and gay movement, to a much greater degree than in any comparable movement, the institutions of culture building have been market-mediated. So bars, discos, special services, newspapers, magazines, phone lines, resorts, urban commercial districts. Non-market forms of association that have been central to other movements, churches, kinship, traditional residence, have been less available for queers. And while gay sports bars are a more recent addition to the LGBT social scene, this does not mean that sports culture and gay sports have not previously overlapped. Establishments that self-identify as gay sports bars began to crop up around 2002. However, I've been able to find gay bar advertisements as early as the 1970s that promoted sports events or sports leagues in conjunction with their more traditional gay establishments. And as a quick side note, I don't know how many people saw the LA Times had a really interesting article about gay sports leagues and serving as an alternative to gay bars. What they missed a little bit is that these sports leagues have been around for a very long time, and it's not necessarily a new phenomenon, but you have some sports leagues, I think there's some in New York City that have been around as an organized sports league for 30, 40 years. So there's a little bit of a lack of sort of historicizing, which I think is important when thinking through some of these concepts. Also, I think it's important to note that while I don't want to be seen as institutionalizing bar patterns monolithically across the LGBT community, historians have noted, as I mentioned, that these material circumstances that produced bars as a site of community were and are influenced by issues of capital. And this structural environment has meant that the institutions of queer culture have typically been dominated by middle-class white men. Furthermore, it should be noted that the majority of the focus of this presentation and the beginning of this project is on the relationship between self-identifying gay men and bar culture. And I do so to reflect the patrons I've observed during field studies and spoken to, and also my own analysis of usernames associated with online posts. And it's not done in an attempt to minimize the debate as to the oppressive nature of binary assumptions of sexuality, nor the often over-predominance of gay male theorizing within the academic realm of queer and LGBT studies. Again, this works back to the sedimentation of heteropatriarchy that continues to sort of haunt gay culture, and specifically here, gay bar culture. Additionally, this definition of sexuality is not to be interpreted solely in sexual object choice, but rather includes all those who seek out other queer men for the creation of both communal bonds and meaningful relationships. So when I've spoken to patrons at these bars, one of the questions I don't normally ask is, are you gay or are you straight? But sort of wait and see how they identify, how they build connections, how they see themselves. Sometimes that's in sort of a traditional self-identification process, and sometimes it's not. So all that being said, over the past 10 years, the United States has seen a proliferation of sort of specifically gay sports bars. And here's where we get to some of the images for the rest of the presentation. So from New York to Los Angeles, Chicago to Washington, D.C., and Atlanta to Boston, LGBT-focused sports bars are beginning to provide a new home for gay sports fans, and in turn, they've begun to provide a new space with which to think through the overlapping realm of sports and queer cultures, to ask how queer individuals are beginning to make sense of these spaces and to begin to figure out what these spaces do within the realm of gay cultural production. And as you'll see in some of the pictures, there are some interesting slogans and taglines for the bars, which you'll pick up as they go along. So interestingly enough, questions of identity and identification practices are common throughout these spaces. As it comes as no surprise, questions of identity and assimilation crop up often within academic LGBT theory, and the addition of sports studies to this realm further complicates how we discuss and interrogate notions of masculinity, sexuality, and identifications. Scholars of both sports and sexuality studies have documented the ways in which, and I quote, "we do not simply create our sexual lives, but rather inherit them and contribute to their ongoing reproduction by the ways that we perform sexuality," end quote. Furthermore, they have elucidated how the center of sports culture, despite moving along the fringes, remains a thoroughly patriarchal and heteronormative realm. However, these spaces of both queer and sports consumption begin to allow for a disidentification with traditional understandings of both sports and queer culture. So while conversations regarding what it means to be the right kind of gay man and the right kind of gay sports fan crop up at the physical sites I've had the opportunity to observe, these debates also spill over into the online realm. One particularly interesting archive has been the Yelp pages for these establishments, along with their own websites. Some allow for users to post comments, some don't. So this project takes as a starting point the notion that the activities that people do online are intimately interwoven with the construction of the offline world. Both sports and LGBT identities are formed by understandings of corporeal experiences, so online reconstructions of these spaces are useful for further problematizing how the body is constituted discursively. The importance of a new space here is then viewed not as an end in itself, but rather as a contextual feature for the reaction of new versions of the self. A cursory look at these online spaces show that patrons use these forums to work through questions of identity while providing seemingly banal reviews. Many users debate the merit of gay sports bars by situating their similarity or dissimilarity to traditional sports bars. And again, I add traditional, but in most cases they just stand in as sports bars, and then gay sports bars are this deviation from the sort of traditional one. So again, here we see the conflation of straight with original or authentic. Additionally, it should be noted that multiple notions of what a straight sports bar is and how it operates are often reified into a monolithic understanding. However, many of these comments are not about abandoning either their queer status or sports fandom, but rather about problematizing and expanding the conversation regarding these static notions. These conversations are made possible by patrons inhabiting positionalities as both LGBT individuals and sports fans. They are connected by remote intimacies, which imply both simultaneous moments of consumption across long distances and networked forms of intimacy among strangers. Specifically, in this case, it refers to shared knowledge of sports culture and the ability to find a queer forum to express re-articulations of a traditionally heteronormative culture. Additionally, we see the physical space of these bars as ways in which gayness and sports are mediated. Many patrons discussed the merits of each bar and the way in which one approaches and exits the bar, as based on its seating arrangements, the service it provides, and the dress of its staff. Here we see the constructed space, not sexual object choice, as a determining factor of a space's place within LGBT sports world. However, this authenticity is again dependent upon an original and discrete straight sports bar. So again, a lot of the discussion had very little to do with who was actually there at times, but more about how these spaces were actually constructed and how they were or were not similar to, again, this idea of an original or a straight sports bar. Furthermore, one can look towards the interactions established within gay sports bars as renegotiating what it means to be out of step with straight time. So I think the notion of straight time, a term I borrow from Jack Halberstam, who is a professor here in the American Studies program, helps to locate how success is queered within sports bar settings. Though regulated by the linear aspects of sports seasons, ordered and predictable programming schedules, and the totalizing frameworks and rules of each individual game, gay sports bars also allow for a slippage or interruption of heteronormative comportment and viewing habits. The one patron lamented this fact by stating, and I quote, "As a gay man, I hold this truth to be self-evident, that gays in a room full of other gays will spend a lot of time checking each other out. This means that attention at a gay sports bar will never primarily be centered on the game," end quote. So this recognition of patrons actively resisting the encoded directives to watch and identify as a heterosexual can be understood as a disidentification in that it is not about assimilation into a heterosexual matrix, but instead a partial disavowal of that cultural form that works to restructure it from within, again, from the minoritarian subject. These sites additionally allow for engagements between identity and affinity, here meant as sexual identity and sports affinity, in a way that does not require LGBT individuals to subordinate one for the other. Rather, they exist in conversation with each other, the residue of both informing and altering the other. So, while the queer aspects of sports are often ignored or disregarded by an industry wary of the implications brought about by recognizing its homosocial qualities, gay sports bars use these common codes to establish queer interactions between seemingly foreign members of the community. Common knowledge of sports, mutual interest, and shared experiences, once produced, understood, and grounded in a decidedly heteronormative manner, are used as prompts to engage in queer connections. Gestures or citational signs, drawn from disparate settings once seen as incompatible, are now incorporated into sort of a hybrid hetero-homo vocabulary. These gestures, recognizable and reconstituted, derivative and innovative, additionally provide further connections across race and class boundaries. Though it would be naive to ignore very prevalent issues of race in the mediation of sports, it would be equally reductive to dismiss sports language as a cultural mode unable to connect across differences and intersectionalities. Ideology is permitted and protested in uniquely queer actions. So I think it's safe to say that gay sports bars should still be pushed to expand the gendered and assimilationist notions of sports consumption. And this call should not override, though, the importance we place on contradictions as generative forces, nor should it disregard sports as a locked-down dead commodity, incapable of being rearticulated to serve a queer purpose. If we are to think of queerness as always in the horizon, again, something argued by Jose Esteban Munoz, then the promise of queer potentiality, situated within sort of quotidian or everyday acts of sports consumption, might help us strain our vision towards this anti-utopic horizon. Okay. Thank you.
Synthesizing literature to inform research plans. So as I said earlier, Mike is also studying for his doctorate. After many years working as a coach and administrator in college athletics, Mike is currently pursuing a PhD in education leadership and policy at the University of Washington. As a graduate research assistant in the college's Center for Leadership in Athletics, Mike is involved in centre research efforts focused on the intersection of higher education and athletics. His current individual research focuses specifically upon student-athlete development as influenced by student-athlete peer culture and the roles associated with intercollegiate athletics personnel. That's a kind of new word for me, intercollegiate. Well, it's not new, but we don't use it in the same way. Mike also has a strong interest in creating more theory-to-practice opportunities in the field, as he is a featured author of the LGBT issues in Sports Theory to Practice blog, which some of you might look up afterwards, possibly. So we welcome Mike.
Great, thanks for the introduction and for all of you for being here. And I want to give a special thanks to Evan and Adam and the folks here at USC for inviting me and recognizing my work and giving me the opportunity to engage in this. And after Evan's presentation, I feel like I want to take this to a more social environment to engage in conversation that's a little more comfortable. But the key operative term for me is that I'm an emerging scholar, and my research is certainly focused on trying to fill gaps in what we already know. And in moving forward, I think it's really important for us to acknowledge folks that have engaged in research in the past. For instance, Pat Griffin, who's in the room here and spoke yesterday, she's been doing this work for many years. And Mike Messner here at USC has been exploring masculinities in sport in times when it wasn't acceptable to host a conference like this. So I think it's really important that we acknowledge their work and for setting the foundation for folks like myself to be able to come in now in a height of time in the world of sport where this topic and the discussions have elevated to levels, I think, beyond what people ever imagined. And so I'm really thrilled and honored to be able to share with you some of my perspective. And again, the key term being emerging. And for me, I'm super intimidated by the formality of academic practice. I started my PhD work many years ago and took time to actually work in the field as a college coach for about 12 years. And I'm returning now to finish my degree, bringing very much a practical lens to the work that I do. And my work moving forward very much is intentional on blurring those lines between academics and practice and helping to facilitate better engagement by those that are in the field to take the work that we're doing and actually apply it to help create better environments for those that they impact, and most specifically student athletes regarding my work. So my topic, peer culture influence in the male student athlete sexual identity, is definitely stems from my own personal experiences growing up in environments that certainly subscribe to the cultural norms of sport for boys. Growing up in the Northwest and being very heavily involved in athletics, I certainly played for coaches and environments that followed strict direction in terms of what traditional cultural norms of sport for males embodies. And so having been in the field now as a coach and sort of identifying some of the key pieces that are influencing the experience for student athletes now, I'm hoping that my work will help facilitate some of the direction that we're headed. So I want to share with you a little bit. I think if you're not familiar with Hudson Taylor's work and with Athlete Ally, please look him up, Google him, watch his videos, bring him here on campus. He is unbelievable. And one of the people that I've sort of attached my work to in terms of what they're doing with Athlete Ally and their message in terms of the ally role and the influence that allies can have on creating more inclusive culture. So the Athlete Ally position here, and if you read through that, essentially puts the focus back on our individual behavior and our individual attention regarding our own behavior as it informs the environments that we engage in. As opposed to where traditional conversations regarding LGBT issues and athletics has simply tried to point the finger at identifying who in our environments identifies as LGBT. So Athlete Ally, having elevated the conversation and sort of shifting that a little bit, has created a conversation that I think is more comfortable for people and certainly is more accessible for those that are in the field, practitioners, coaches, administrators, even student athletes, to engage in dialogue that's much more user-friendly, if you will. You know, I try to talk to people about LGBT identity, and often the conversations become stale because they're uncomfortable, or they don't know how to engage in the conversation without being offensive or trying to tread water too lightly. And I think the focus, when we put it on our own behavior, it changes that and elevates the level of engagement by those that are involved. So as we move forward, why only the male gender? And for me, again, it stems from personal experience. But some of these points here are pretty key in sort of understanding that a little bit. There's definitely a lack of depth within the literature. A lot of the literature that exists primarily focuses on the female perspective and experience in sports. When you talk about lesbian identity and athletics, there's a varying stigma when you talk about gender and athletic participation across when you compare males and females. There's greater peer rejection found and aggression among boys as compared to females. And boys are more often to choose group peer interactions that emphasize competition, which I think is really critical to understand and to keep in mind. So when we look at the culture of sport for males, some of these things have already been talked about in the presentations before. Sport certainly remains the most important element of the peer status system for boys. It has forever, and it continues today, and is still a large part of the conversation and the dialogue. Social norms of sport are certainly rooted in the more dominant forms of masculinity. Sport obviously can define young males' masculine identity, and the Institute of Sport traditionally includes high levels of homophobia and heterosexism. So when we define peer culture, George Koo is the individual that sort of framed this. Generally speaking, it's that any group with which an individual identifies and affiliates themselves in seeking acceptance and approval over a prolonged period of time. So when we transition that to the campus structure, what we know is that this encompasses the forces and processes that shape individual and collective life on campus in terms of identity, group membership, acceptable discourse, and desirable behaviors. And what we know about social structures and interactions is that peer cultures are certainly reinforcing the behaviors and the identity norms within those environments. So, in talking about the culture, the impact of peer culture, it's important to understand the concept of peer victimization. We got to know, and I think all of us, we've grown up in peer circles. We have our friends. We've been involved in athletic spaces that maybe they're teammates, but maybe not our friends. But those certainly create some of those peer culture environments where a lot of these situations and experiences can occur. So what we know about peer victimization, peers control the opportunities to engage and be accepted into peer environments, okay? And peer victimization is either relational or physical, okay? And includes some things such as rejection, exclusion, bullying, intimidation, and the language, physical and verbal harassment. So moving forward, for me, it's the role of the bystander that is really intriguing. Okay, bystanders are sort of defined as the individuals that are on the periphery. They're the observers. They're there, but maybe they're not involved. So bystander situations create helpful or hurtful dynamics. Reasons why bystanders won't get involved. They feel low levels of peer empathy. They feel that maybe it's the victim's responsibility that they're in that situation. And then there's obviously sometimes a reluctance for them to engage in situations that they may not know much about, to step in and try to curb a behavior that they don't agree with, for them to stick their neck out there. That's certainly, I think we've all maybe been in that position. So I want to highlight two recent studies, larger studies that have happened here in our country by two larger organizations focused on these issues, and one being produced recently by GLSEN, the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network, which focused primarily on middle schools and high schools and athletic participation. So what they found, some of the compelling statistics for me, 28% of LGBT student athletes were reported that they were harassed or assaulted due to their sexual orientation. And one of the things that was more interesting for me, and having been an athlete growing up, LGBT individuals completely are reporting that they're avoiding athletic spaces altogether. 39% avoiding the locker room. The locker room culture is a completely different topic and one thing that we could talk about all day because of sort of the nuances that happen in those spaces when coaches are present and when coaches are not around. Campus Pride is another organization that partnered with some folks at Penn State University to create and sort of examine student-athlete climate and culture at the college level. So the student-athlete climate survey was then transitioned into a report for Campus Pride, examining campus climate, which they define as the learning, living, and working environments of colleges and universities. And in that report, 39% of LGBTQ student-athletes reported being harassed due to their sexual orientation. But the thing that stuck out most to me, 64% of all of that harassment is actually happening within their own environment, their own locker room spaces, their own practice experiences by their coaches, by their teammates, by other peers that are on their campuses. So what we're determining is that climate matters. And when we're talking about the LGBT experience, this is a critical piece when we consider the development of student athletes and their experience over their 4 or 5 years on any given college campus. So I think it's also important to discuss a little bit the student athlete profile, which maybe all of you are sort of familiar with a little bit, but I want to highlight some things that I think are pretty critical here. They hold dual roles on campus. Okay, when you talk about the academic pressures as well as the need to pay attention to their athletic priorities, there's some conflict there. And when you talk about those people that make up those peer structures for them, whether it's a peer student on campus versus a peer student athlete, or a coach versus an instructor, there can be some conflicting messages there. Student athletes are under unique pressures. They have increased schedule demands, and they're institutional ambassadors, and they certainly have to be compliant with the rules and regulations of the institution and the NCAA. So one of the things that I like to talk about, too, is that the opportunities for identity development are not necessarily easy to access for these individuals. So at the University of Washington, for instance, a Pac-12 school, my alma mater, I grew up in, and I worked in the athletic department at UW. UW is situated in an environment geographically where the main campus is very much removed from what they've developed and created for athletics and for student athletes. But in support of that, they've tried to create and simulate on-campus resources to be in place within the athletic confines for student athletes to make it easier for them to engage in some of those support services. But one of the areas that they've certainly missed the mark on is providing quality support for those that are dealing with identity issues. So at UW, their stock response is if they have an individual that's dealing with LGBT issues, they refer them to our Q Center, which is up on campus. It's difficult for them to access. The availability of those resources in conjunction with the time that student athletes might have to be able to go to that resource don't always mesh. Okay, so that's something that we definitely need to consider. And as well, when you think about a Q Center or an LGBT resource center, student athletes and their identity as a student athlete and maybe their identity as an LGBT individual or someone that's questioning their identity, they may walk into a Q Center and completely not identify with the things that they see when they walk in that room. Rainbow flags, whatever it may be. So it's one of the things that we're trying to identify, and I'll talk about a little bit later in terms of the identity of the student athlete, what the LGBT identity piece actually means for those individuals, and what it represents in terms of the type of support and services that are needed during their time on campus. So why is this significant? So we want to further evolve the sport culture, create more inclusive sports space, which is essentially what Athlete Ally's mission is as well, if you refer back to that first slide. We want to fill the gaps in the literature regarding the influence of student-athlete peer culture. Males reported that they have more negative attitudes towards LGBT individuals than females, so that's certainly something we want to change. But in that same report, it was also stated that the connections with LGBT individuals equated to more positive attitudes. So those that actually had relationships and connections with individuals that identified as LGBT had better attitudes towards that community. The pressure or the presence of inclusive masculinities can lead to greater team bonding and cohesiveness. So it's something that I'm certainly starting to explore now as we have some academic folks that are discussing sort of outside the boundaries of hegemonic masculinity and those dominant forms of masculinity and what that might look like. And then when we couple sexual orientation diversity with an inclusive diversity strategy, what they're learning is that it's leading to greater performance and outcomes. And this, for me, in moving forward, when you're talking about dealing with administrators and coaches, is the point that I try to stress and emphasize with them more than anything else. So this comes from sport management literature. It's literature that's focused on organizational infrastructure and leadership. And what I'm trying to do, working with a colleague from that field, and merging this intersection of higher ed and athletics at the intercollegiate level, we're trying to take some of this to transition it to coaches and administrators and say, hey, if your longevity in your role is dependent on winning and losing, and what we're learning in these organizational structures and the literature involved there, if we're finding more productive employees, if we're finding higher outcomes, if we're finding more engagement, then why would we not subscribe to creating more inclusive environments for your teams to allow your student athletes to be who they are, focus on the task at hand, and help you do what you want to do, which is win games? So it's an interesting argument and discussion that we're starting to have with coaches, and it's actually starting to raise their eyebrows a little bit more around some of this stuff and engage them a little bit more critically. So quickly, we'll just kind of dance through some of the theory here, and I have a couple of frameworks that I'm drawing from, and one is Chickering's theory of identity development. He offers some of the vectors that sort of establish what that looks like for an individual, but for me, it's these key environmental influences that sort of set up my work. Okay, and for instance, the friendships in the student communities are where a lot of my work sort of lies right now. What is that peer culture like? How are peers influencing student athletes in their development? And what's the impact it's creating, therefore, on the culture that they reside in? So the second framework, the lifespan model of gay, lesbian, and bisexual identity, same thing. So we're talking about the variables of identity formation, and for me, it's within the interactive intimacies and those relationships that individuals sustain with their culture around them that are the most important and where my focus is. So Bronfenbrenner has created this ecological systems model, human ecology, and sort of the development of the individual. And I want to briefly talk about this because it highlights the person, the process, and the context within which they engage on a daily basis. And for me, it lands in what's called the microsystem and the mesosystem, and I'll get there in a moment. But the macrosystem of this model represents sort of the cultural expectations, the social forces that surround the individuals and what they do. The exosystems are sort of the influences that they aren't necessarily a part of, but certainly impact their experience and their existence. So for an athlete, it would be NCAA policy, institutional policy, team guidelines, all those things that they may not have a say in, but certainly influence their behavior and their participation. When we move to the mesosystem and the microsystem, again, this is where my work lies. The microsystem is the immediate environment for the individual. The peer-to-peer connection, the dialogue between peers and the student athletes and coaches, the dialogue between them and their professors. What's it like when they return to their dorms or to their fraternities? What's it like when they're in the locker room among their student athlete peers? How are those things influencing or either supporting or conflicting in terms of the message around their development as a gay individual? The mesosystem, therefore, is then the interactions between those settings. So for me, having been in the practical world and now spending time on campus in the classroom, I have actually found a very unique opportunity to connect with student athletes on a level that I don't think would be accessible, especially at UW, if I were to try to approach them about this content within the athletic department. And that's within the classroom. So I've had the opportunity to speak to a few classes on these topics, classes that are 50% student athletes. And what I found is that when you remove those individuals from those environments, those athletic spaces where they tend to be very homophobic, super conservative, the focus is certainly very much different than what they engage in academically, they're much more open to engage in conversation. So the last time I spoke, I had a line of student athletes that came up to me to talk about issues that they were experiencing within the athletic department, which was compelling to me considering that they didn't feel that they had the opportunities to raise those points to administrators and coaches within the athletic department. So for me, it's interesting because I don't have any influence there, but I can only support sort of helping to advise and guide some of their next steps in helping create better environments and spaces for them and their teammates. So it'll be interesting moving forward to see what happens. So I've developed this sort of conceptual framework, which is pretty simple. When you talk about the student athlete, and that shaded area is sort of the overlap of those dual roles. The interactions there in the middle all relate to the peer culture in terms of the microsystem and the mesosystem and how all those things sort of interact and engage with one another. And the outcomes then, again, are either positive or negative. And once we continue to gather more data and sort of identify what the key pieces are that are in place, I hope to eventually get to the point where we're providing some intervention. So we're taking some of the bystanders, we're converting them to allies, which hopefully will then lead to more positive outcomes, and then helping empower those individuals to then provide some peer leadership for others in their athletic department. So if they're negative outcomes, then again, we want to try to bring in some folks or some resources that we can help to educate, to then sort of cycle back and empower student athletes to be more vocal, to be more visible, to play upon the power of peer culture and the role of the ally. So my research questions right now: what factors of student-athlete peer culture influence positive sexual identity development experiences and outcomes for gay male student athletes? That sort of is outlined in the presentation here. And then moving forward, too, for me, I certainly want to investigate the impact of peer ally behavior on an institution's athletics department climate and level of inclusivity regarding LGBT identity. So again, the ally behavior and role is going to be critical in terms of helping create more inclusive spaces. So Hudson offers a great quote, which I think is pretty interesting and compelling, and he, sort of relates back to a lot of the social change that has happened over, the lifetime of our country, and says that something along the lines that the minority needs the support of the majority in order for social change to occur. So when you talk about the ally behavior, the peer culture impact, that certainly resonates well with the things that I'm trying to investigate here as far as the role of creating more inclusive space. So in the final slide, for future directions, I want to further investigate issues in sport regarding profiles of individuals involved. So you talk about the student athlete, talk about capital for the student athlete, which is an interesting piece as well. If the capital relating to is the individual, the star player versus someone who doesn't see much playing time. Is there influence there that may change how that individual is supported? As well, the role of the bystander is something that will certainly be investigated more. We need more an increased examination of athlete identity as compared to the LGBT identity, which I mentioned. We need increased assessment and intervention at the coach and administrator levels, and we certainly need to examine the intersection of LGBT identity across other marginalized identities. So when you're talking about religion, race, gender identity, we certainly need to explore those things a little bit further. So that's it.
Okay, we have about 15 minutes for questions. So, any questions related to Mary, Louise on Rough and Tumble, Evan on the Queer Clubhouse, and Mike on peer culture influence on male student athlete sexual identity development? Yes?
I have a question for Evan. How would you define a sports bar? Like a bar that I hang out in San Diego every Saturday or Sunday has 10 college games on Sunday, there'll be 10 whatever, but the rest of the week they have dancing and go-go boys and all the other things. So
Yeah.
Is that a sports bar?
For the way the project is situated right now, I'm sort of in a similar way of letting people speak to their own identifications, letting these bars speak. So I'm looking mostly at the ones that sort of self-identify as, as a sports bar, and that's sort of their entryway into sort of like the consumption practices of bar culture. So part of what I've tried to do in the historicizing is look at, this is sort of a phenomenon that I really can only trace back to 2002, but before that there were certainly spaces that showed games that had support for gay sports leagues. I'm not looking at them as much at the moment, but just trying to sort of keep my focus to something more specific at the moment. But I think that there are interesting engagements, and that's something that, talking to the owners of Gym Bar here in Los Angeles, difficulty they had is people had already created other communities, other spaces to watch these games in. So then now to have a gay sports bar, they didn't really feel like they needed one. They would watch it, at some of the other bars they would put on, they would put on games or playoff games and things like that. So that's sort of part of the tension, but again, that's how I define it. Yeah.
Put your hands up if you've got a question. Yes, well done, at the back.
Hi, Mike, what you said about the difficulty in combining the theory with the practice really resonates with me, and I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about what you think might be a way towards combining those things, or how you've seen, you talked a little bit about the classroom space as a possible space for athletes to talk in ways that they can't talk about in the athletic spaces. Can you say a little bit more about what your hope would be in your own role, or just in general,
Sure. Well, I definitely think for me it's it's a little unique. I had a really great conversation with Pat Griffin just before we started this, and Pat, I think, also follows sort of the same train of thought around theory, bridging theory to practice. And I actually work in an environment where we work specifically on trying to offer more practical application of what academic folks are learning. And so one way that we do that is that we're taking some of the literature and just sort of transitioning it to be more accessible in terms of the language that's used. I think that's one of the things that certainly is intimidating to folks. When you talk about academic and empirical investigation, those terms certainly can turn people off to wanting to engage, because it often involves a lot of reading. It involves trying to spend time trying to determine what something actually means, as opposed to just stating it very clearly and plainly to them to sort of help transition exactly what this may mean to impact their environment. So for me, I think I will end up being situated in an environment where I will be more focused on the practice piece. And even though doing empirical work, it's all situated on knowing that I'm going to take this work and inform those that are actually in the field doing the work. So I think it's going to be some trial and error for me. I think it differs across administrators, for coaches. I think those things are certainly things to consider. But even in my own experiences, when trying to connect with athletic departments, even though I've spent many years working in athletic departments and approaching athletic departments where I have really strong relationships, when you bring up academic work, it's really hard to sort of break down any boundaries that may open up their minds to what that might look like in terms of supporting their own work. I've had student athletes come to me saying that they've wanted more content. I've had administrators come to me and say that student athletes are asking for more content, but yet administrators that aren't doing anything about it to provide the content for student athletes. So I think it's going to be an interesting position for my colleague and I with the work that we're trying to do to be able to break down those walls further, but definitely the classroom, definitely trying to debrief academic work so that it's more suitable and understandable for academic or for practitioners. And then organizations like Athlete Ally, we're aligning with them to do a lot of their evaluation or we're trying right now to align to be able to do the evaluation that supports the work that they're doing when they visit campuses. So I think that in itself will also lend to bridging the gap between some of the empirical investigation versus some of the practical stuff that they're delivering. So I hope that helps.
I'm going to ask Mary Lou a question. I guess most of us realise that the modern Olympics was set up by Pierre de Coubertin because of his fear that French men were becoming effeminate, and it was a way to kind of symbolically promote a masculinity to a nation that may go into war at some point. So I just wondered if there was a figurehead behind creating this rough and tumble play discourse, if there was one particular person, or was it more of an institutional discourse? Was it during McCarthyism or?
The beginnings of the actual kind of science on effeminate boys, like that was very specifically on about effeminate boys, was the first paper that I think is important is from 1960. And there were two particular researchers. I can't remember if he was UCLA or USC. I'm sorry, I know that's a bad relation. I understand it. But I think he was at UCLA, a guy called Richard Green, who actually ended up being the author pretty much of the piece that's in the DSM. And he just started this research program. And literally, like, they put up notices. Do you know, like they wrote to doctors, they wrote to teachers and educators asking them for people. So they really constructed this thing kind of out of, there were certainly gender became very more strict in the 1950s after World War II and everything. So they were playing on cultural norms at the time, but I think they actually helped create a bigger discourse in the world at large, because these things get taken up, right? You read about the DSM in popular magazines and stuff like that, so they help circulate them. But historically, there's been lots of big important people worried about men and boys in different historical circumstances becoming effete or being gay. You know, the rise of the woman teacher in North America. You know, oh my God, we're putting our boy children into schools where they're being taught by women all day long. They're all going to turn, and you know, different historical time periods. They weren't worried about them turning into fags, but becoming effete or effeminate, not expressing the right kind of masculinity. And of course, what that was like changed historically. But Richard Green, and he wrote a very widely reviewed and referenced book called The Sissy Boy Syndrome in the late 1980s. And you can imagine all, like, you look in the gay press in the late 1980s, all sorts of reviews of this book and people quite taking him to task. Even, and the contradiction in all this, their intentions were not as bad as it seems when you read the actual text they produce, right? Like, all this stuff is very contradictory. But so Green actually, you know, he has some kind of good things to say about, you know, discrimination against gay people or against transgender and transsexual people and that sort of thing. But science and intentions don't always fit over top of each other the way they hope they will, right? Yes?
I think for me, it's an area that I haven't focused on explicitly. But at the same time, when you talk about the concept of inclusion, it sort of frames the conversation in a broader context that we can incorporate some of those other identities, which is now sort of putting me in a position where I'm starting to engage in more of that dialogue around the intersection of other identities with a racial identity or with a gender identity. And there's some really good dialogue going on around gay African American males that I've been around a little bit, which is pretty compelling when you talk about some of the stereotype and stigma associated with them exclusively that may be different for white males per se. But for me, I haven't really gone there yet, but it's definitely starting to grow more just from this point of entry when we're talking about inclusion as a concept and sort of our own behavior and what that represents. And it's also an entry point for us to be able to get people to engage more and then introduce the LGBT piece. Because for a long period of time, we have many people that are talking about gender issues and race issues and so on, but the shyness is when we bring in, you know, the LGBT piece. So for us, we're finding that the accessibility to their opinions about inclusion is a way for us to incorporate LGBT sort of in this backhanded way.
Most of the work I do is historical with documents that come out of, so the DSM, right, that come out of institutions and things that we would say are, you know, documents through which you can see the production of dominance, you know, whether it's race, gender, or class, and that sort of thing. So, are they talking about racial diversity? Not so much. But I think how scholars take them up, and scholars who are interested in questions of intersectionality and, you know, all sorts of different levels where people are diverse, are considered differently, racial backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, or whatever it is, people are actually trying to read those documents for the way they construct ideas about racial dominance. So they're about whiteness. We read those documents as documents that produce normality as this white thing or a normal gender identity through a white lens and that sort of thing. So it's kind of a backwards way into dealing with the question.
For me, in terms of this particular project, I've actually been surprised, and again, it's just based on sort of, you know, visual cues. A lot of the patrons in these sports bars it's a more diverse collection of individuals, both in terms of race and ethnicity, but also in terms of gender, than I've observed as I'm trying to situate them against these, you know, quote unquote straight bars. For my work, that veers more towards the media studies side, and I think Adam will talk a little bit about this tomorrow in his presentation. There's certainly a way in which sports is whitewashed, right, in the media and particularly within media engagements in a way that sports culture is not, and there's a disconnect between those two. And so that's something that I'm particularly invested in and interested in terms of how do we connect notions of citizenship to whiteness in a way that sort of maybe doesn't deal with issues of racial diversity. But that's not something I get to explore in this particular project as much, but it is a part of sort of this larger engagement with media.
I think it is interesting that where it could go in regards to that too, because certain sports tend to be heavily racially diverse.
Yeah, and I think that there are really easy ways in which people take up sexuality and assume, oh, well, this sport is more or less homophobic or just based on the racial makeup. And I think that it's more complicated than just that, but I think sometimes that becomes an easy way to sort of move along the conversation. So
It's a good question. Yes.
So, Mary, when you were talking, I thought about Blades of Glory right away. I don't know if you ever
Totally.
seen that movie.
Yeah.
I'm curious about just how those kind of media forms like movies and TV and those kind of like, I guess you could say, creating content really kind of structure and just reinforce kind of this hegemonic view of masculinity and how they do that, or if you've seen any kind of trend away from that and towards maybe a more accepting view.
The Blades of Glory, actually, I opened the book with like a description of Blades of Glory, which I actually saw with, I don't know if you were here yesterday, but with Samantha King, who's here, we work at the same university. We went to see it like on a weekday night in theater. We were the only people in the theater. You're not really asking about Blades of Glory, but I was prepared to hate that movie, and I actually really, and I'm not a big, I don't go to tons of kind of popular movies, and so I really liked it. And one of the things that was interesting about that movie is the way they actually used the stereotypes as the basis of the humor, but then played with them, and how they there's an absent discourse of gayness in that movie. Like, nobody is identified as gay, and yet over the coaches, there's like, the coach does stained glass or something, I forget, there's like a little piece of stained glass that the coach has made a piece of art of him kissing his boyfriend that's over the window. So there's like these weird little things coming in. So it gives you a lot to talk about, that movie. But in terms of the media piece is where I started the skating project. And because there are so many, there has been so much change in media coverage over, and I'm thinking here now of Canadian figure skating coverage, which is a little bit different than the coverage on American television, but trying very hard not to talk about, and this is just about gender, like what the girls look like. You can tell somebody gave them a memo and said, try not to talk about their appearance. And they, they're doing this live, right? So they start, and then you hear them kind of change, and that sort of thing. But it is interesting. Do you know the notion about colorblind racism? We just don't talk about race when it's obviously a really important thing that's happening right in front of our faces. That's what I feel has been happening around some of the issues around gender nonconformity and sport. So I don't know what I want them to do, but so there's Johnny Weir is probably the person you're most familiar with, and you probably heard about some of the discussion, the really terrible discussion of his persona and presentation during the last Olympic Games, some of it, I believe, coming from commentators and journalists in Quebec. Just really homophobic, idiotic stuff. But it's very interesting to me that commentators really try not to say, like, here's Johnny Weir using his body, making very different movements than everybody else, and nobody mentions it. So I want us to find a way to, like, discuss these things so that we're not kind of, so that our discussions don't fall into the kind of stereotypical train track that they can just pick up and get carried away on. And we're not there yet. So I think the kind of, whatever the equivalent, the gender blind commentary or the gay blind commentary commentary is where we have gone to from the kind of more offensive stuff before, but it doesn't really leave us with anything, you know, like, so I don't know if that answers your question or not, but media is hugely important.
I was just aware of the time, Adam, but
Yeah, I think we'll go ahead and close there. And Johnny Weir actually was announced today as a new NBC commentator for the Olympics.
Love it.
Good.
He will hopefully change some things. But please give our panelists a